Welcome to Chapter 9, Key Issue 1. I am your host, Andrew Patterson. Today, we're going to be taking a look at why does development vary among countries. So, the Human Development Index. This is something that was created by the United Nations. It was supposed to measure the level of development in each country, meaning how developed are you or not. It has three factors associated with it. Number one, a decent standard of living. Two, a long and healthy life. And three, access of knowledge. Like how much are you educated? These are rated in the areas of very high, medium, and low. So for example, maybe you take Russia. So it's ranked about 7.7 on the HDI scale, meaning we're pretty high, as opposed to sub-Saharan Africa, where we're only at zero point 0.4, just beyond 0.4. So you can see ranked by these things right here, kind of where we're developed. Obviously, when we look at developed countries such as the United States and Japan, we're very developed, approaching 1. And developing countries are lucky to get over 0.6. A decent standard of living. This is one of the aspects that we're looking up for your HDI. Income. We look at gross national income, or GNI. This is the value of output of goods and services in 1 year, including money that leaves and enters the country. Another aspect of income is gross domestic product, or GDP. This is the value of output of goods and services in a country for a year, but does not account for money leaving a country. So the difference between these two, because it gets very confusing, is GDP does not account for money leaving a country. So no money leaving. Then we also have purchasing power parity, or PPP. This is the adjustment to the GNI to account for costs of goods. For example, do you want to calculate an individual person? We take the GNI divided by total population. So for the United States in 2011, the GNI was 15 trillion. We divide that by the population, which was 312 million. That equals 47,000. So that's the adjusted gross national income per person. So for example, a person in the United States, most likely in 2011, the average is going to be $47,000. As opposed to looking at the GNI of developed countries, overall, the GNI is 34,000. In developing countries, they only made 7,000. You can see how big the gap is there, just based on those numbers. Economic structure. The primary sector. This is people who directly extract materials from the earth through agricultural, mining, fishing, and forestry. The GNI is decreased in developed countries, but it remains high in developing countries. So we look at developed countries, such as the United States. We're not doing a lot of primary sector activities these days because we're developed and we tend to be doing things that are more down here in the tertiary sector. We'll get to that though. So in developing countries, it remains high because they don't have the technology and infrastructure, so they're doing all these basic things like agricultural, mining, fishing, and forestry, plus they also tend to have a lot of these resources. Secondary sector. These are manufacturers that process, transform, assemble raw materials into useful products and consumer goods. The GNI is sharply decreased in developed countries. Again, in developed countries, we're not doing a lot of secondary sector activities. We're not doing a lot of processing or transforming or assembling raw materials anymore because we're developed. So we see that decreased for places like the United States and Japan. The tertiary sector. This is the provision of goods and services in exchange for payment like retailing, banking, law, education, and government. The GNI is large in developed countries and it continues to grow. That makes sense, right? We're highly developed, so we're going to be doing a lot of things that are associated with banking, law, education, and government. Productivity. Workers in developed countries are more productive than in developed countries. That seems kind of biased there, but let's face it. In developed countries, we have lots of infrastructure, we have technologies, and we are highly trained. So as far as productivity, we can get more done with less. Productivity is the value of a particular product compared to the amount of labor needed to make it. It's measured by the value added per capita, or per person, which is what per capita means. Value added, this is the gross value of a product minus the cost of raw materials and energy. So, for example, if you have a product but it takes a lot of money to get it created or materials to get it created, then that's going to be minus the value added. So we look at in 2010, the United States has a value added of 5,900, meaning we get a lot more value from the skill and the productivity of the people in our country because we can do more with less. Japan is even more so. In China, there's not tons of value added because people aren't as skilled and it takes a lot more to reach the market. India, same thing. Inequality adjusted HDI. So we know what HDI, well, this is speaking to inequality adjusted HDI. This is the indicator of development that modifies the HDI to account for inequality in a country. So do we have perfect equality? Then the HDI and IHDI are the same. If the IHDI, is lower, inequality exists. So of course, we're going to get the lowest scores in sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia because in these places you have a lot of disparity, lack of infrastructure, you've got gender bias, and they're still developing countries. Consumer goods. Part of the wealth is generated. It's developed countries used to purchase goods and services. Especially important are transportation and communications. So as far as consumer goods, some of the things that are most important are transportation and communications. We look at motor vehicles. Motor vehicles give us access to jobs and they allow us to distribute our products efficiently and independently. Telephones, they enhance interaction with providers of raw materials and customers of goods and services. If we don't have access to telephones, it makes it really difficult to do business. And computers, of course, that's how we communicate and share information with buyers and suppliers. So much so these days, even more than telephones. So here we see motor vehicles in these countries. Obviously, North America is jam-packed. Europe is jam-packed with motor vehicles. That gives them an advantage because we're able to take our goods and services everywhere or go buy our goods and services. We look at internet users per 1,000 people. In developed countries, like everybody's having the internet. Developing countries, it's still up and coming. You can see that it's going to make it more difficult to advance, to be developed as a society, to compete in a global market if we don't have the internet. We're not able to communicate, we're not able to buy and sell, we're not able to keep up with current trends. A long and healthy life. Health is considered an important measure of development. A goal of development is to provide nutrition and medical services for people to live in a long and healthy life. Life expectancy. This is a contributor to HDI, the Human Development Index. The average life expectancy is 70. In developed countries and regions, it's 80. So in the United States, we're expected to live longer. In developing countries, it's only about 68 because they don't have infrastructure, they lack health care, they lack education. So they're not able to provide as much health for their people as they can in developed countries. In Latin America, we're looking at about 75 life expectancy. In South Asia, you're expected to only make it to 65 years old. In sub-Saharan Africa, where they're really limited on their resources, life expectancy is only 55. Can you believe that? That's approaching what it was, during colonial periods, medieval periods. Infants, 94% survive in developing countries. 99.5% survive in developed countries. So pretty much if you're being born in a developed country, the likelihood is you're going to survive as an infant. Access to knowledge. There's two parts to this: quantity and quality. Access to knowledge meaning how long are you going to school? The average globally is 7 years. In developed countries, it's 11 years of school. In developing countries, it's only 6 years of school. In the future, the United Nations expects kids in developed countries to graduate from college with an average of 16 years of schooling, but only 11 years in developed countries. Quality is the other aspect of it. What's the pupil to teacher ratio? How many kids are in your classroom? Is it, 20 kids for every one teacher? Or is it way more than that? That affects the quality of schooling. Literacy rate. How many people can read? How many people can write? If you can't do either, you could be going to school for 10 years, but you're not getting a good quality of schooling. So we look at the average years of schooling here. United States, Europe, you start to see, Australia, you start to see the most. You wonder why people aren't having as much success and infrastructure and they're not as developed. Looking at sub-Saharan Africa, we can see why, because they're not going to school very long. Percent literate, can they read and write? Europe, people mostly can read and write. North America, South America is filling in nicely, and of course Russia and Australia are doing great as well. These are all factors that go into the development index. Within the development index, of course, looking at countries, you have variations within countries in certain regions. Within regions, for example, Southwest Asia and North Africa, they have a huge desert areas and they can't really support life. Except you look at countries like Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates, they have access to petroleum. So they're able to thrive because they have the money to create infrastructure, education, and healthcare. It's extremely limited for countries like Egypt, Jordan, Syria, and others. Countries, variations within countries. You look at the United States and you think we're pretty wealthy and developed, which we are, but there's still variation. We're very wealthy in the Northeast, but much poorer in the Southeast. You think about back through the course of our history, why might that be? Well, the Northeast developed a lot faster. They had industry. Think about the Civil War. What happened? We've got plantations and industry built on agriculture. That was devastated because we didn't have industry like the North did. That still kind of continues to this day. You've got Brazil, where it's wealthy along the Atlantic coast, but lower in the interior rainforest. So looking at Brazil here, we've got areas where you got major cities here that are highly developed, but as you go up into the rainforest, it's varied extremely over the region. China's the same thing. It's wealthy along the East Coast, but it's got problems in the desert and in the mountains. So we look at China. Here's all the East Coast where you got the major cities, but then as we get rural, then we're really seeing a lot of variation and disparity. Mexico, they're going to be highly developed at the border. Well, they're much more developed at the border. There's a variation because at the border, there people access to jobs. They have maquiladoras or plants where people are working. And then down here, away from the United States, it's definitely varied. That's our look at Chapter 9, Key Issue 1.